Chapter 11. Murder. Katherine wakened the next morning to brilliant sunshine. She went along to breakfast early, but met none of her acquaintances of the day before. When she returned to her compartment, it had just been restored to its daytime appearance by the conductor, a dark man with a drooping moustache and melancholy face. "Madame is fortunate," he said. "The sun shines. It is always a great disappointment to passengers when they arrive on a grey morning." "I should have been disappointed, certainly," said Katherine. The man prepared to depart. "We are rather late, madame," he said. "I will let you know just before we get to Nice." Katherine nodded. She sat by the window, entranced by the sunlit panorama. The palm trees, the deep blue of the sea, the bright yellow mimosa came with all the charm of novelty to the woman who for 14 years had known only the drab winters of England. When they arrived at Cannes, Katherine got out and walked up and down the platform. She was curious about the lady in the mink coat and looked up at the windows of her compartment. The blinds were still drawn down, the only ones to be so on the whole train. Katherine wondered a little, and when she re-entered the train she passed along the corridor and noticed that these two compartments were still shuttered and closed. The lady of the mink coat was clearly no early riser. Presently the conductor came to her and told her that in a few minutes the train would arrive at Nice. Katherine handed him a tip. The man thanked her but still lingered. There was something odd about him. Katherine, who had at first wondered whether the tip had not been big enough, was now convinced that something far more serious was amiss. His face was of a sickly pallor, he was shaking all over, and looked as if he had been frightened out of his life. He was eyeing her in a curious manner. Presently he said abruptly, "Madame will excuse me, but is she expecting friends to meet her at Nice?" "Probably," said Katherine. "Why?" But the man merely shook his head and murmured something that Katherine could not catch, and moved away, not reappearing until the train came to rest at the station, when he started handing her belongings down from the window. Katherine stood for a moment or two on the platform, rather at a loss, but a fair young man with an ingenuous face came up to her and said rather hesitatingly, "Miss Grey, is it not?" Katherine said that it was, and the young man beamed upon her seraphically and murmured, "I am Chubby, you know, Lady Tamplin's husband. I expect she mentioned me, but perhaps she forgot. Have you got your billet de bagage? I lost mine when I came out this year, and you would not believe the fuss they made about it. Regular French red tape." Katherine produced it, and was just about to move off beside him, when a very gentle and insidious voice murmured in her ear, "A little moment, madame, if you please." Katherine turned to behold an individual who made up for insignificance of stature by a large quantity of gold lace and uniform. The individual explained. There were certain formalities. Madame would perhaps be so kind as to accompany him. The regulations of the police— He threw up his arms. Absurd, doubtless, but there it was. Mr. Chubby Evans listened with a very imperfect comprehension, his French being of a limited order. "So like the French," murmured Mr. Evans. He was one of those staunch patriotic Britons who, having made a portion of a foreign country their own, strongly resent the original inhabitants of it. Always up to some silly dodge or other. They've never tackled people on the station before, though. This is something quite new. I suppose you'll have to go." Katherine departed with her guide. Somewhat to her surprise, he led her towards a siding where a coach of the departed train had been shunted. He invited her to mount into this, and preceding her down the corridor, held aside the door of one of the compartments. In it was a pompous-looking official personage, and with him a nondescript being who appeared to be a clerk. The pompous-looking personage rose politely, bowed to Katherine, and said, "You will excuse me, madame, but there are certain formalities to be complied with. Madame speaks French, I trust." "Sufficiently, I think, monsieur," replied Katherine in that language. "That is good. Pray be seated, madame. I am Monsieur Coe, the commissary of police." He blew out his chest importantly, and Katherine tried to look sufficiently impressed. "You wish to see my passport?" she inquired. "Here it is." The commissary eyed her keenly and gave a little grunt. "Thank you, madame," he said, taking the passport from her. He cleared his throat. but what I really desire is a little information." "Information?" The commissary nodded his head slowly. "About a lady who has been a fellow passenger of yours. You lunched with her yesterday." "I'm afraid I can't tell you anything about her. We fell into conversation over our meal, but she is a complete stranger to me. I've never seen her before." "And yet," said the commissary sharply, "you returned to her compartment with her after lunch and sat talking for some time?" "Yes," said Katherine, "that is true." The commissary seemed to expect her to say something more. He looked at her encouragingly. "Yes, madame." "Well, monsieur," said Katherine, "you can perhaps give me some kind of idea of that conversation?" "I could," said Katherine, "but at the moment I see no reason to do so." In somewhat British fashion she felt annoyed. This foreign official seemed to her impertinent. "No reason?" cried the commissary. "Oh yes, madame, I can assure you that there is a reason." "Then perhaps you will give it to me." The commissary rubbed his chin thoughtfully for a minute or two without speaking. "Madame," he said at last, "the reason is very simple. The lady in question was found dead in her compartment this morning." "Dead?" gasped Katherine. "What was it? Heart failure?" "No," said the commissary in a reflective, dreamy voice. "No, she was murdered." "Murdered!" cried Katherine. "So you see, madam, why we are anxious for any information we can possibly get." "But surely her maid—" "The maid has disappeared." "Oh!" Katherine paused to assemble her thoughts. Since the conductor had seen you talking with her in her compartment, he quite naturally reported the fact to the police, and that is why, madame, we have detained you, in the hope of gaining some information." "I'm very sorry," said Katherine. "I don't even know her name." "Her name is Kettering, that we know from her passport and from the labels on her luggage. If we—" There was a knock on the compartment door. Monsieur Coe frowned. He opened it about 6 inches. "What is the matter?" he said peremptorily. "I cannot be disturbed." The egg-shaped head of Catherine's dinner acquaintance showed itself in the aperture. On his face was a beaming smile. "My name," he said, "is Hercule Poirot." "Not," the commissary stammered, "not the Hercule Poirot?" "The same," said Monsieur Poirot. "I remember meeting you once, Monsieur Coe, at the Sûreté in Paris, though doubtless you have forgotten me." "Not at all, monsieur, not at all," declared the commissary heartily. "But enter, I pray of you. You know of this?" "Yes, I know," said Hercule Poirot. "I came to see if I might be of any assistance." "We should be flattered," replied the commissary promptly. "Let me present you, Monsieur Poirot, to—" He consulted the passport he still held in his hand. "To Mademoiselle Gray." Poirot smiled across at Katherine. "It is strange, is it not," he murmured, "that my words should have come true so quickly." "Mademoiselle, alas, can tell us very little," said the commissary. "I have been explaining," said Katherine, "that this poor lady was a complete stranger to me." Poirot nodded. "But she talked to you, did she not?" he said gently. "You formed an impression, is it not so?" "Yes," said Katherine thoughtfully. "I suppose I did." "And that impression was—" "Yes, mademoiselle," the commissary jerked himself forward. "Let us by all means have your impressions." Katherine sat turning the whole thing over in her mind. She felt in a way as if she were betraying a confidence, but with that ugly word murder ringing in her ears, she dared not keep anything back. Too much might hang upon it, so as nearly as she could she repeated word for word the conversation she had had with the dead woman. "That is interesting," said the commissary, glancing at the other. "Eh, Monsieur Poirot, that is interesting. Whether it has anything to do with the crime—" He left the sentence unfinished. "I suppose it could not be suicide," said Katherine rather doubtfully. "No," said the commissary, "it could not be suicide. She was strangled with a length of black cord." "Oh," Katherine shivered. Monsieur Coe spread out his hands apologetically. "It is not nice. No, I think that our train robbers are more brutal than they are in your country. It is horrible." "Yes, yes." He was soothing and apologetic. "But you have great courage, mademoiselle. At once, as soon as I saw you, I said to myself, Mademoiselle has great courage. That is why I am going to ask you to do something more, something distressing, but I assure you very necessary." Katherine looked at him apprehensively. He spread out his hands apologetically. "I am going to ask you, mademoiselle, to be so good as to accompany me to the next compartment." "Must I?" asked Katherine in a low voice. "Someone must identify her," said the commissary, "and since the maid has disappeared—" He coughed significantly. "You appear to be the person who has seen most of her since she joined the train." "Very well," said Katherine quietly. "If it is necessary—" She rose. Poirot gave her a little nod of approval. "Mademoiselle is sensible," he said. "May I accompany you, Monsieur Coe?" "Enchanted, my dear Monsieur Poirot." They went out into the corridor, and Monsieur Coe unlocked the door of the dead woman's compartment. The blinds on the far side had been drawn halfway up to admit light. The dead woman lay on the berth to their left in so natural a posture that one could have thought her asleep. The bedclothes were drawn up over her, and her head was turned to the wall, so that only the red auburn curls showed. Very gently, Monsieur Coe laid a hand on her shoulder and turned the body back so that the face came into view. Katherine flinched a little and dug her nails into her palms. A heavy blow had disfigured the features almost beyond recognition. Poirot gave a sharp exclamation. "When was that done, I wonder?" he demanded. "Before death or after?" "The doctor says after," said Monsieur Coe. "Strange," said Poirot, drawing his brows together. He turned to Katherine. "Be brave, mademoiselle. Look at her well. Are you sure that this is the woman you talked to in the train yesterday?" Katherine had good nerves. She steeled herself to look long and earnestly at the recumbent figure. Then she leaned forward and took up the dead woman's hand. "I am quite sure," she replied at length. "The face is too disfigured to recognize, but the build and carriage and hair are exact, and besides I noticed this," she pointed to a tiny mole on the dead woman's wrist, "while I was talking to her." "Bon," approved Poirot. "You are an excellent witness, mademoiselle. There is then no question as to the identity, but it is strange all the same." He frowned down on the dead woman in perplexity. Monsieur Coe shrugged his shoulders. "The murderer was carried away by rage, doubtless," he suggested. "If she had been struck down it would have been comprehensible," mused Poirot. "But the man who strangled her slipped up behind and caught her unawares. A little choke, a little gurgle. That is all that would be heard, and then afterwards that smashing blow on her face. Now why? Did he hope that if the face were unrecognizable she might not be identified, or did he hate her so much that he could not resist striking that blow even after she was dead?" Katherine shuddered, and he turned at once to her kindly. "You must not let me distress you, mademoiselle," he said. "To you this is all very new and terrible. To me, alas, it is an old story. One moment, I pray of you both." They stood against the door watching him as he went quickly round the compartment. He noted the dead woman's clothes neatly folded on the end of the berth, the big fur coat that hung from a hook, and the little red lacquer hat tossed up on the rack. Then he passed through into the adjoining compartment, that in which Katherine had seen the maid sitting. Here the berth had not been made up. 3 or 4 rugs were piled loosely on the seat. There was a hat box and a couple of suitcases. He turned suddenly to Katherine. "You were in here yesterday," he said. "Do you see anything changed, anything missing?" Katherine looked carefully round both compartments. "Yes," she said. "There is something missing, a scarlet morocco case. It had the initials RVK on it. It might have been a small dressing case or a big jewel case. When I saw it, the maid was holding it." "Ah," said Poirot. "But surely," said Katherine, of course I don't know anything about such things, but surely it is plain enough if the maid and the jewel case are missing." "You mean that it was the maid who was the thief?" "No, mademoiselle, there is a very good reason against that." "What?" "The maid was left behind in Paris." He turned to Poirot. "I should like you to hear the conductor's story yourself," he murmured confidentially. "It is very suggestive." "Mademoiselle would doubtless like to hear it also," said Poirot. "You do not object, Monsieur le Commissaire?" "No," said the commissary, who clearly did object very much. "No, certainly, Monsieur Poirot, if you say so. You have finished here?" "I think so. One little minute." He had been turning over the rugs, and now he took one to the window and looked at it. picking something off it with his fingers. "What is it?" demanded Monsieur Coe sharply. "4 auburn hairs." He bent over the dead woman. "Yes, they are from the head of Madame." "And what of it? Do you attach importance to them?" Poirot let the rug drop back on the seat. "What is important, what is not? One cannot say at this stage, but we must note each little fact carefully." They went back again into the first compartment, and in a minute or two the conductor of the carriage arrived to be questioned. "Your name is Pierre Michel," said the commissary. "Yes, Monsieur le Commissaire." "I should like you to repeat to this gentleman," he indicated Poirot, "the story that you told me as to what happened in Paris." "Very good, Monsieur le Commissaire. It was after we had left the Gare de Lyon. I came along to make the beds, thinking that Madame would be at dinner, but she had a dinner basket in her compartment. She said to me that she had been obliged to leave her maid behind in Paris, so that I need make up only 1 berth. She took her dinner basket into the adjoining compartment and sat there while I made up the bed. Then she told me that she did not wish to be wakened early in the morning, that she liked to sleep on. I told her I quite understood, and she wished me good night." "You yourself did not go into the adjoining compartment?" "No, monsieur." "Then you did not happen to notice if a scarlet morocco case was amongst the luggage there?" "No, monsieur, I did not. Would it have been possible for a man to have been concealed in the adjoining compartment?" The conductor reflected. "The door was half open," he said. "If a man had stood behind that door I should not have been able to see him, but he would, of course, have been perfectly visible to Madame when she went in there." "Quite so," said Poirot. "Is there anything more you have to tell us?" "I think that is all, monsieur. I can remember nothing else." "And now this morning?" prompted Poirot. "As Madame had ordered, I did not disturb her. It was not until just before Cannes that I ventured to knock at the door. Getting no reply, I opened it. The lady appeared to be in her bed asleep. I took her by the shoulder to rouse her, and then—" "And then you saw what had happened," volunteered Poirot. "Très bien. I think I know all I want to know." "I hope, Monsieur le Commissaire, it is not that I have been guilty of any negligence," said the man piteously. "Such an affair to happen on the blue train. It is horrible." "Console yourself," said the commissary. "Everything will be done to keep the affair as quiet as possible, if only in the interests of justice. I cannot think you have been guilty of any negligence." "And Monsieur le Commissaire will report as much to the company?" But certainly," said Monsieur Coe impatiently. "That will do now." The conductor withdrew. "According to the medical evidence," said the commissary, "the lady was probably dead before the train reached Lyons. Who then was the murderer? From Mademoiselle's story, it seems clear that somewhere on her journey she was to meet this man of whom she spoke. Her action in getting rid of the maid seems significant. Did the man join the train at Paris, and did she conceal him in the adjoining compartment? If so, they may have quarrelled, and he may have killed her in a fit of rage. That is one possibility. The other, and the more likely to my mind, is that her assailant was a train robber travelling on the train, that he stole along the corridor unseen by the conductor, killed her, and went off with the red morocco case, which doubtless contained jewels of some value. In all probability, he left the train at Lyons, and we have already telegraphed to the station there for full particulars of anyone seen leaving the train. Or he might have come on to Nice," suggested Poirot. "He might," agreed the commissary, "but that would be a very bold course." Poirot let a minute or two go by before speaking, and then he said, "In the latter case, you think the man was an ordinary train robber?" The commissary shrugged his shoulders. "It depends. We must get hold of the maid. It is possible that she has the red morocco case with her. If so, then the man of whom she spoke to Mademoiselle may be concerned in the case, and the affair is a crime of passion. I myself think the solution of a train robber is the more probable. These bandits have become very bold of late." Poirot looked suddenly across to Katherine. "And you, mademoiselle," he said, "you heard and saw nothing during the night?" "Nothing," said Katherine. Poirot turned to the commissary. "We need detain mademoiselle no longer, I think," he suggested. The latter nodded. She will leave us her address, he said. Katherine gave him the name of Lady Tamplin's villa. Poirot made her a little bow. You permit that I see you again, mademoiselle, he said. Or have you so many friends that your time will be all taken up? On the contrary, said Katherine, I shall have plenty of leisure, and I shall be very pleased to see you again. Excellent, said Poirot, and gave her a little friendly nod. This shall be a Roman policier à nous. We will investigate this affair together. Chapter 12. At the Villa Margarite. Then you were really in the thick of it all, said Lady Tamplin enviously. My dear, how thrilling. She opened her china blue eyes very wide and gave a little sigh. A real murder, said Mr. Evans gloatingly. Of course Chubby had no idea of anything of the kind, went on Lady Tamplin. He simply could not imagine why the police wanted you. My dear, what an opportunity. I think, yes, I certainly think something might be made out of this. A calculating look rather marred the ingenuousness of the blue eyes. Katherine felt slightly uncomfortable. They were just finishing lunch, and she looked in turn at the three people sitting round the table. Lady Tamplin, full of practical schemes, Mr. Evans, beaming with naive appreciation, and Lennox with a queer crooked smile on her dark face. Marvellous luck, murmured Chubby. I wish I could have gone along with you and seen all the exhibits. His tone was wistful and childlike. Katherine said nothing. The police had laid no injunctions of secrecy upon her, and it was clearly impossible to suppress the bare facts or try to keep them from her hostess. But she did rather wish it had been possible to do so. Yes, said Lady Tamplin, coming suddenly out of her reverie, I do think something might be done. A little account, cleverly written up. An eyewitness, a feminine touch. How I chatted with the dead woman, little thinking, that sort of thing, Rot, said Lennox. You have no idea, said Lady Tamplin in a soft, wistful voice, what newspapers will pay for a little titbit. Written, of course, by someone of really unimpeachable social position. You would not like to do it yourself, I dare say, Katherine dear, but just give me the bare bones of it, and I will manage the whole thing for you. Mr. de Havilland is a special friend of mine. We have a little understanding together. A most delightful man, not at all reporterish. How does the idea strike you, Katherine? I would much prefer to do nothing of the kind, said Katherine bluntly. Lady Tamplin was rather disconcerted at this uncompromising refusal. She sighed and turned to the elucidation of further details. A very striking-looking woman, you said. I wonder now who she could have been. You didn't hear her name? It was mentioned, Katherine admitted, but I can't remember it. You see, I was rather upset. I should think so, said Mr. Evans. It must have been a beastly shock. It is to be doubted whether, even if Katherine had remembered the name, she would have admitted the fact. Lady Tamplin's remorseless cross-examination was making her restive. Lennox, who was observant in her own way, noticed this and offered to take Katherine upstairs to see her room. She left her there, remarking kindly before she went, "You mustn't mind, Mother. She would make a few pennies profit out of her dying grandmother if she could." Lennox went down again to find her mother and her stepfather discussing the newcomer. "Presentable," said Lady Tamplin. "Quite presentable. Her clothes are all right. That grey thing is the same model that Gladys Cooper wore in Palm Trees in Egypt." "Have you noticed her eyes?" "What?" interposed Mr. Evans. "Never mind her eyes, Chubby," said Lady Tamplin tartly. "We are discussing the things that really matter." "Oh, quite," said Mr. Evans, and retired into his shell. "She doesn't seem to me very malleable," said Lady Tamplin, rather hesitating to choose the right word. "She has all the instincts of a lady, as they say in books," said Lennox with a grin. "Narrow-minded," murmured Lady Tamplin. "Inevitable under the circumstances, I suppose." "I expect you will do your best to broaden her," said Lennox with a grin, "but you will have your work cut out. Just now, you noticed, she stuck down her forefeet and laid back her ears and refused to budge." "Anyway," said Lady Tamplin hopefully, "she doesn't look to me at all mean. Some people, when they come into money, seem to attach undue importance to it." "Oh, you'll easily touch her for what you want," said Lennox. "And after all, that is all that matters, isn't it? That is what she is here for." "She is my own cousin," said Lady Tamplin with dignity. "Cousin, eh?" said Mr. Evans, waking up again. "I suppose I call her Katherine, don't I?" "It is of no importance at all what you call her, Chubby," said Lady Tamplin. "Good," said Mr. Evans. "Then I will. Do you suppose she plays tennis?" he added hopefully. "Of course not," said Lady Tamplin. "She has been a companion, I tell you. Companions don't play tennis or golf. They might possibly play golf croquet, but I have always understood that they wind wool and wash dogs most of the day." "Oh, God," said Mr. Evans. "Do they really?" Lennox drifted upstairs again to Katherine's room. "Can I help you?" she asked rather perfunctorily. On Katherine's disclaimer, Lennox sat on the edge of the bed and stared thoughtfully at her guest. "Why did you come?" she said at last. "To us, I mean. We're not your sort." "Oh, I'm anxious to get into society." "Don't be an ass," said Lennox promptly, detecting the flicker of a smile. "You know what I mean well enough. You are not a bit what I thought you would be. I say you have got some decent clothes." She sighed. "Clothes are no good to me. I was born awkward. It's a pity because I love them." "I love them too," said Katherine, "but it has not been much use my loving them up to now. Do you think this is nice?" She and Lennox discussed several models with artistic fervour. "I like you," said Lennox suddenly. "I came up to warn you not to be taken in by Mother, but I think now that there is no need to do that. You are frightfully sincere and upright and all those queer things, but you are not a fool. Oh, hell, what is it now?" Lady Tamplin's voice was calling plaintively from the hall. "Lennox, Derek has just rung up. He wants to come to dinner tonight. Will it be all right? I mean, we haven't got anything awkward like quails, have we?" Lennox reassured her and came back into Katherine's room. Her face looked brighter and less sullen. "I'm glad old Derek is coming," she said. "You'll like him." "Who is Derek?" "He is Lord Leconbury's son, married a rich American woman. Women are simply potty about him." "Why?" "Oh, the usual reason. Very good-looking and a regular bad lot. Everyone goes off their head about him." "Do you?" "Sometimes I do," said Lennox, "and sometimes I think I would like to marry a nice curate and live in the country and grow things in frames." She paused a minute and then added, "An Irish curate would be best, and then I should hunt." After a minute or two she reverted to her former theme. "There is something queer about Derek. All that family are a bit potty. Mad gamblers, you know. In the old days they used to gamble away their wives and their estates, and did most reckless things just for the love of it. Derek would have made a perfect highwayman, debonair and gay, just the right manner." She moved to the door. "Well, come down when you feel like it." Left alone, Katherine gave herself up to thought. Just at present, she felt thoroughly ill at ease and jarred by her surroundings. The shock of the discovery in the train and the reception of the news by her new friends jarred upon her susceptibilities. She thought long and earnestly about the murdered woman. She had been sorry for Ruth, but she could not honestly say that she had liked her. She had divined only too well the ruthless egoism that was the keynote of her personality, and it repelled her. She had been amused and a trifle hurt by the other's cool dismissal of her when she had served her turn. That she had come to some decision, Katherine was quite certain, but she wondered now what that decision had been. Whatever it was, death had stepped in and made all decisions meaningless. Strange that it should have been so, and that a brutal crime should have been the ending of that fateful journey. But suddenly Katherine remembered a small fact that she ought perhaps to have told the police, a fact that had for the moment escaped her memory. Was it of any real importance? She had certainly thought that she had seen a man going into that particular compartment, but she realized that she might easily have been mistaken. It might have been the compartment next door, and certainly the man in question could be no train robber. She recalled him very clearly as she had seen him on those two previous occasions, once at the Savoy and once at Cook's office. No, doubtless she had been mistaken. He had not gone into the dead woman's compartment, and it was perhaps as well that she had said nothing to the police. She might have done incalculable harm by doing so. She went down to join the others on the terrace outside. Through the branches of mimosa she looked out over the blue of the Mediterranean. and whilst listening with half an ear to Lady Tamplin's chatter, she was glad that she had come. This was better than St. Mary Mead. That evening she put on the mauvey pink dress that went by the name of Soupir d'automne, and after smiling at her reflection in the mirror, went downstairs with, for the first time in her life, a faint feeling of shyness. Most of Lady Tamplin's guests had arrived, and since noise was the essential of Lady Tamplin's parties, the din was already terrific. Chubby rushed up to Katherine, pressed a cocktail upon her, and took her under his wing. "Oh, here you are, Derek," cried Lady Tamplin as the door opened to admit the last comer. "Now at last we can have something to eat. I'm starving." Katherine looked across the room. She was startled. So this was Derek, and she realized that she was not surprised. She had always known that she would someday meet the man whom she had seen 3 times by such a curious chain of coincidences. She thought, too, that he recognized her. He paused abruptly in what he was saying to Lady Tamplin, and went on again as though with an effort. They all went into dinner, and Katherine found that he was placed beside her. He turned to her at once with a vivid smile. "I knew I was going to meet you soon," he remarked, "but I never dreamt that it would be here. It had to be, you know. Once at the Savoy and once at Cook's, never twice without 3 times. Don't say you can't remember me or never noticed me. I insist upon your pretending that you noticed me anyway." "Oh, I did," said Katherine, "but this is not the 3rd time, it is the 4th. I saw you on the blue train." On the blue train. Something undefinable came over his manner. She could not have said just what it was. It was as though he had received a check, a setback. Then he said carelessly, "What was the rumpus this morning? Somebody had died, hadn't they?" "Yes," said Katherine slowly, "somebody had died." "You shouldn't die on a train," remarked Derek flippantly. "I believe it causes all sorts of legal and international complications, and it gives the train an excuse for being even later than usual." "Mr. Kettering?" A stout American lady who was sitting opposite leaned forward and spoke to him with the deliberate intonation of her race. "Mr. Kettering, I do believe you have forgotten me, and I thought you such a perfectly lovely man." Derek leaned forward answering her, and Katherine sat almost dazed. Kettering, that was the name, of course, she remembered it now, but what a strange, ironical situation. Here was this man whom she had seen go into his wife's compartment last night, who had left her alive and well, and now he was sitting at dinner quite unconscious of the fate that had befallen her. Of that there was no doubt. He did not know. A servant was leaning over Derek, handing him a note and murmuring in his ear. With a word of excuse to Lady Tamplin, he broke it open, and an expression of utter astonishment came over his face as he read. Then he looked at his hostess. "This is most extraordinary. I say, Rosalie, I'm afraid I will have to leave you. The prefect of police wants to see me at once. I can't think what about." "Your sins have found you out," remarked Lennox. "They must have," said Derek. "Probably some idiotic nonsense, but I suppose I shall have to push off to the prefecture. How dare the old boy rout me out from dinner? It ought to be something deadly serious to justify that." And he laughed as he pushed back his chair and rose to leave the room. Chapter 13. Vanalden gets a telegram. On the afternoon of the 15th of February, a thick yellow fog had settled down on London. Rufus Vanalden was in his suite at the Savoy and was making the most of the atmospheric conditions by working double time. Knighton was overjoyed. He had found it difficult of late to get his employer to concentrate on the matters in hand. When he had ventured to urge certain courses, Vanalden had put him off with a curt word. But now Vanalden seemed to be throwing himself into work with redoubled energy, and the secretary made the most of his opportunities. Always tactful, he plied the spur so unobtrusively that Vanalden never suspected it. Yet in the middle of this absorption in business matters, one little fact lay at the back of Vanalden's mind. A chance remark of Knighton's, uttered by the secretary in all unconsciousness, had given rise to it. It now festered unseen, gradually reaching further and further forward into Vanalden's consciousness, until at last, in spite of himself, he had to yield to its insistence. He listened to what Knighton was saying with his usual air of keen attention, but in reality not one word of it penetrated his mind. He nodded automatically, however, and the secretary turned to some other papers. As he was sorting them out, his employer spoke. "Do you mind telling me that over again, Knighton?" For a moment, Knighton was at a loss. "You mean about this, sir?" He held up a closely written company report. No, said Vanalden. "What you told me about seeing Ruth's maid in Paris last night. I can't make it out. You must have been mistaken." "I can't have been mistaken, sir. I actually spoke to her." "Well, tell me the whole thing again." Knighton complied. "I'd fixed up the deal with Bartheimer's," he explained, "and had gone back to the Ritz to pick up my traps preparatory to having dinner and catching the 9 o'clock train from the Gare du Nord. At the reception desk I saw a woman whom I was quite sure was Mrs. Kettering's maid. I went up to her and asked if Mrs. Kettering was staying there." Yes, said Vanalden. "Of course, naturally. And she told you that Ruth had gone on to the Riviera and had sent her to the Ritz to await further orders there." "Exactly that, sir." "It is very odd," said Vanalden. "Very odd indeed, unless the woman had been impertinent or something of that kind." "In that case," objected Knighton, "surely Mrs. Kettering would have paid her down a sum of money and told her to go back to England. She would hardly have sent her to the Ritz." "No," muttered the millionaire, "that's true." He was about to say something further, but checked himself. He was fond of Knighton and liked and trusted him, but he could hardly discuss his daughter's private affairs with his secretary. He had already felt hurt by Ruth's lack of frankness, and this chance information which had come to him did nothing to allay his misgivings. Why had Ruth got rid of her maid in Paris? What possible object or motive could she have had in so doing? He reflected for a moment or two on the curious combination of chance. How should it have occurred to Ruth, except as the wildest coincidence, that the first person that the maid should run across in Paris should be her father's secretary? But that was the way things happened. That was the way things got found out. He winced at the last phrase. It had arisen with complete naturalness to his mind. Was there, then, something to be found out? He hated to put this question to himself. He had no doubt of the answer. The answer was, he was sure of it, Armand de la Roche. It was bitter to Vanalden that a daughter of his should be gulled by such a man, yet he was forced to admit that she was in good company, that other well-bred and intelligent women had succumbed just as easily to the Count's fascination. Men saw through him, women did not. He sought now for a phrase that would allay any suspicion that his secretary might have felt. "Ruth is always changing her mind about things at a moment's notice," he remarked, and then he added in a would-be careless tone, "The maid didn't give any, reason for this change of plan." Knighton was careful to make his voice as natural as possible as he replied, "She said, sir, that Mrs. Kettering had met a friend unexpectedly." "Is that so?" The secretary's practised ears caught the note of strain underlying the seemingly casual tone. "Oh, I see. Man or woman?" "I think she said a man, sir." Vanalden nodded. His worst fears were being realized. He rose from his chair and began pacing up and down the room, a habit of his when agitated. Unable to contain his feelings any longer, he burst forth, "There is one thing no man can do, and that is to get a woman to listen to reason. Somehow or other, they don't seem to have any kind of sense. Talk of woman's instinct. Why, it is well known all the world over that a woman is the surest mark for any rascally swindler. Not 1 in 10 of them knows a scoundrel when she meets one. They can be preyed on by any good-looking fellow with a soft side to his tongue." "If I had my way—" He was interrupted. A page boy entered with a telegram. Vanalden tore it open, and his face went a sudden chalky white. He caught hold of the back of a chair to steady himself, and waved the page boy from the room. "What's the matter, sir?" Knighton had risen in concern. "Ruth," said Vanalden hoarsely, "Mrs. Kettering?" "Killed. An accident to the train." Vanalden shook his head. "No. From this it seems she has been robbed as well. They don't use the word, Knighton, but my poor girl has been murdered." "Oh, my God, sir!" Vanalden tapped the telegram with his forefinger. "This is from the police at Nice. I must go out there by the first train." Knighton was efficient as ever. He glanced at the clock. 5 o'clock from Victoria, sir. "That's right. You will come with me, Knighton." Tell my man, Archer, and pack your own things. See to everything here. I want to go round to Curzon Street." The telephone rang sharply, and the secretary lifted the receiver. "Yes, who is it?" Then to Vanalden. "Mr. Goby, sir." "Goby, I can't see him now. No, wait, we have plenty of time. Tell them to send him up." Vanalden was a strong man. Already he had recovered that iron calm of his. Few people would have noticed anything amiss in his greeting to Mr. Goby. "I am pressed for time, Goby. Got anything important to tell me?" Mr. Goby coughed. "The movements of Mr. Kettering, sir. You wished them reported to you." "Yes, well?" "Mr. Kettering, sir, left London for the Riviera yesterday morning." "What?" Something in his voice must have startled Mr. Goby. That worthy gentleman departed from his usual practice of never looking at the person to whom he was talking, and stole a fleeting glance at the millionaire. "What train did he go on?" demanded Vanalden. "The blue train, sir." Mr. Goby coughed again and spoke to the clock on the mantelpiece. "Mademoiselle Mirelle, the dancer from the Parthenon, went by the same train." Chapter 14. Ada Mason's Story. I cannot repeat to you often enough, monsieur, our horror, our consternation, and the deep sympathy we feel for you. Thus, Monsieur Carrege, the juge d'instruction, addressed Vanalden. Monsieur Co, the commissary, made sympathetic noises in his throat. Vanalden brushed away horror, consternation, and sympathy with an abrupt gesture. The scene was the examining magistrate's room at Nice. Besides Monsieur Carrege, the commissary, and Vanalden, there was a further person in the room. It was that person who now spoke. "Monsieur Vanalden," he said, "desires action, swift action." "Ah," cried the commissary, "I have not yet presented you. Monsieur Vanalden, this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot. You have doubtless heard of him. Although he has retired from his profession for some years now, his name is still a household word as one of the greatest living detectives." "Pleased to meet you, Monsieur Poirot," said Vanalden, falling back mechanically on a formula that he had discarded some years ago. "You have retired from your profession?" "That is so, monsieur. Now I enjoy the world." The little man made a grandiloquent gesture. "Monsieur Poirot happened to be travelling on the blue train," explained the commissary, "and he has been so kind as to assist us out of his vast experience." The millionaire looked at Poirot keenly. Then he said unexpectedly, "I am a very rich man, Monsieur Poirot. It is usually said that a rich man labours under the belief that he can buy everything and everyone. That is not true. I'm a big man in my way, and one big man can ask a favour from another big man." Poirot nodded a quick appreciation. "That is very well said, Monsieur Vanalden. I place myself entirely at your service." "Thank you," said Vanalden. "I can only say call upon me at any time, and you will not find me ungrateful. And now, gentlemen, to business." "I propose," said Monsieur Carrege, "to interrogate the maid, Ada Mason. You have her here, I understand." "Yes," said Vanalden. "We picked her up in Paris in passing through. She was very upset to hear of her mistress's death, but she tells her story coherently enough." "We will have her in then," said Monsieur Carrege. He rang the bell on his desk, and in a few minutes Ada Mason entered the room. She was very neatly dressed in black, and the tip of her nose was red. She had exchanged her grey travelling gloves for a pair of black suede ones. She cast a look round the examining magistrate's office in some trepidation, and seemed relieved at the presence of her mistress's father. The examining magistrate prided himself on his geniality of manner, and did his best to put her at her ease. He was helped in this by Poirot, who acted as interpreter, and whose friendly manner was reassuring to the Englishwoman. "Your name is Ada Mason, is that right?" "Ada Beatrice I was christened, sir," said Mason primly. "Just so, and we can understand, Mason, that this has all been very distressing." "Oh, indeed it has, sir. I have been with many ladies and always given satisfaction, I hope, and I never dreamt of anything of this kind happening in any situation where I was." "No, no," said Monsieur Carrege. "Naturally, I have read of such things, of course, in the Sunday papers, and then I always have understood that those foreign trains—" She suddenly checked her flow, remembering that the gentlemen who were speaking to her were of the same nationality as the trains. "Now let us talk this affair over," said Monsieur Carrege. "There was, I understand, no question of your staying in Paris when you started from London?" "Oh, no, sir. We were to go straight through to Nice." "Have you ever been abroad with your mistress before?" "No, sir. I had only been with her 2 months, you see." "Did she seem quite as usual when starting on this journey?" "She was worried-like and a bit upset, and she was rather irritable and difficult to please." Monsieur Carrege nodded. "Now then, Mason, what was the first you heard of your stopping in Paris?" "It was at the place they call the Gare de Lyon, sir. My mistress was thinking of getting out and walking up and down the platform. She was just going out into the corridor when she gave a sudden exclamation and came back into her compartment with a gentleman. She shut the door between her carriage and mine so that I didn't see or hear anything, till she suddenly opened it again and told me that she had changed her plans. She gave me some money and told me to get out and go to the Ritz. They knew her well there, she said, and would give me a room. I was to wait there until I heard from her. She would wire me what she wanted me to do. I had just time to get my things together and jump out of the train before it started off. It was a rush." "While Mrs. Kettering was telling you this, where was the gentleman?" "He was standing in the other compartment, sir, looking out of the window." "Can you describe him to us?" "Well, you see, sir, I hardly saw him. He had his back to me most of the time. He was a tall gentleman and dark. That's all I can say. He was dressed very like any other gentleman in a dark blue overcoat and a grey hat." "Was he one of the passengers on the train?" "I don't think so, sir. I took it that he had come to the station to see Mrs. Kettering in passing through. Of course he might have been one of the passengers. I never thought of that." Mason seemed a little flurried by the suggestion. "Ah," Monsieur Carrege passed lightly to another subject. "Your mistress later requested the conductor not to rouse her early in the morning. Was that a likely thing for her to do you think?" "Oh, yes, sir. The mistress never ate any breakfast and she didn't sleep well at nights, so that she liked sleeping on in the morning." Again Monsieur Carrege passed to another subject. "Amongst the luggage there was a scarlet morocco case, was there not?" he asked. "Your mistress's jewel case?" "Yes, sir." "Did you take that case to the Ritz?" "Me take the mistress's jewel case to the Ritz?" "Oh, no, indeed, sir." Mason's tones were horrified. "You left it behind you in the carriage?" "Yes, sir." "Had your mistress many jewels with her, do you know?" "A fair amount, sir. Made me a bit uneasy sometimes, I can tell you, with those nasty tales you hear of being robbed in foreign countries. They were insured, I know, but all the same it seemed a frightful risk. Why, the rubies alone, the mistress told me, were worth several £100,000. "The rubies? What rubies?" barked Vanalden suddenly. Mason turned to him. "I think it was you who gave them to her, sir, not very long ago." "My God!" cried Vanalden. "You don't say she had those rubies with her? I told her to leave them at the bank." Mason gave once more the discreet cough, which was apparently part of her stock in trade as a lady's maid. This time it expressed a good deal. It expressed far more clearly than words could have done that Mason's mistress had been a lady who took her own way. "Ruth must have been mad," muttered Vanalden. "What on earth could have possessed her?" Monsieur Carrege in turn gave vent to a cough, again a cough of significance. It riveted Vanalden's attention on him. "For the moment," said Monsieur Carrege, addressing Mason, "I think that is all. If you will go into the next room, mademoiselle, they will read over to you the questions and answers, and you will sign accordingly." Mason went out, escorted by the clerk, and Vanalden said immediately to the magistrate, "Well?" Monsieur Carrege opened a drawer in his desk, took out a letter, and handed it across to Vanalden. "This was found in Madame's handbag. Cher ami," the letter ran, "I will obey you, I will be prudent, discreet, all those things that a lover most hates. Paris would perhaps have been unwise, but the Isles d'Or are far away from the world, and you may be assured that nothing will leak out. It is like you and your divine sympathy to be so interested in the work on famous jewels that I am writing. It will, indeed, be an extraordinary privilege to actually see and handle these historic rubies. I'm devoting a special passage to Heart of Fire, my wonderful one. Soon I will make up to you for all those sad years of separation and emptiness. Your ever-adoring Armand. Chapter 15. The Comte de la Roche. Vanalden read the letter through in silence. His face turned a dull, angry crimson. The men watching him saw the veins start out on his forehead, and his big hands clenched themselves unconsciously. He handed back the letter without a word. Monsieur Carrege was looking with close attention at his desk. Monsieur Coe's eyes were fixed upon the ceiling, and Monsieur Hercule Poirot was tenderly brushing a speck of dust from his coat sleeve. With the greatest tact, they none of them looked at Vanalden. It was Monsieur Carrege, mindful of his status and his duties, who tackled the unpleasant subject. "Perhaps, monsieur," he murmured, "you are aware by whom this letter was written?" "Yes, I know," said Vanalden heavily. "Ah?" said the magistrate inquiringly. "A scoundrel who calls himself the Comte de la Roche." There was a pause. Then Monsieur Poirot leaned forward, straightened a ruler on the judge's desk, and addressed the millionaire directly. "Monsieur Vanalden, we are all sensible, deeply sensible, of the pain it must give you to speak of these matters, but believe me, monsieur, it is not the time for concealments. If justice is to be done, we must know everything. If you will reflect a little minute, you will realize the truth of that clearly for yourself." Vanalden was silent for a moment or two, then almost reluctantly he nodded his head in agreement. "You are quite right, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "Painful as it is, I have no right to keep anything back." The commissary gave a sigh of relief, and the examining magistrate leaned back in his chair and adjusted a pince-nez on his long, thin nose. "Perhaps you will tell us in your own words, Monsieur Vanalden," he said, "all that you know of this gentleman?" "It began 11 or 12 years ago in Paris. My daughter was a young girl then, full of foolish romantic notions like all young girls are. Unknown to me, she made the acquaintance of this Comte de la Roche. You have heard of him, perhaps?" The commissary and Poirot nodded in assent. "He calls himself the Comte de la Roche," continued Vanalden, "but I doubt if he has any right to the title." "You would not have found his name in the Almanach de Gotha," agreed the commissary. "I discovered as much," said Vanalden. "The man was a good-looking, plausible scoundrel with a fatal fascination for women. Ruth was infatuated with him, but I soon put a stop to the whole affair. The man was no better than a common swindler." "You are quite right," said the commissary. "The Comte de la Roche is well known to us. If it were possible, we should have laid him by the heels before now, but ma foi, it is not easy. The fellow is cunning. His affairs are always conducted with ladies of high social position. If he obtains money from them under false pretenses or as the fruit of blackmail, eh bien, naturally they will not prosecute. To look foolish in the eyes of the world, oh no, that would never do, and he has an extraordinary power over women." "That is so," said the millionaire heavily. "Well, as I told you, I broke the affair up pretty sharply. I told Ruth exactly what he was, and she had, perforce, to believe me. About a year afterwards, she met her present husband and married him. As far as I knew, that was the end of the matter. But only a week ago I discovered, to my amazement, that my daughter had resumed her acquaintance with the Comte de la Roche. She had been meeting him frequently in London and Paris. I remonstrated with her on her imprudence, for I may tell you, gentlemen, that on my insistence she was preparing to bring a suit for divorce against her husband." "That is interesting," murmured Poirot softly, his eyes on the ceiling. Vanalden looked at him sharply and then went on. "I pointed out to her the folly of continuing to see the Comte under the circumstances. I thought she agreed with me." The examining magistrate coughed delicately. "But according to this letter," he began and then stopped. Vanalden's jaw set itself squarely. "I know it's no good mincing matters. However unpleasant, we have got to face facts. It seems clear that Ruth had arranged to go to Paris and meet de la Roche there. After my warnings to her, however, she must have written to the Count suggesting a change of rendezvous." "The Isle d'Or," said the commissary thoughtfully, "are situated just opposite Hyères, a remote and idyllic spot." Vanalden nodded. "Oh, my God, how could Ruth be such a fool?" he exclaimed bitterly. "All this talk about writing a book on jewels. Why, he must have been after the rubies from the first." "There are some very famous rubies," said Poirot, "originally part of the crown jewels of Russia. They are unique in character, and their value is almost fabulous." There has been a rumour that they have lately passed into the possession of an American. Are we right in concluding, monsieur, that you were the purchaser?" "Yes," said Vanalden. "They came into my possession in Paris about 10 days ago." "Pardon me, monsieur, but you have been negotiating for their purchase for some time." "A little over 2 months. Why?" "These things become known," said Poirot. "There is always a pretty formidable crowd on the track of jewels such as these." A spasm distorted the other's face. "I remember," he said brokenly, "a joke I made to Ruth when I gave them to her. I told her not to take them to the Riviera with her, as I could not afford to have her robbed and murdered for the sake of the jewels. My God, the things one says, never dreaming or knowing they will come true." There was a sympathetic silence, and then Poirot spoke in a detached manner. "Let us arrange our facts with order and precision. According to our present theory, this is how they run. The Comte de la Roche knows of your purchase of these jewels. By an easy stratagem, he induces Madame Katherine to bring the stones with her. He then is the man Mason saw in the train at Paris." The other three nodded in agreement. "Madame is surprised to see him, but she deals with the situation promptly. Mason is got out of the way. A dinner basket is ordered. We know from the conductor that he made up the berth for the first compartment, but he did not go into the second compartment, and that a man could quite well have been concealed from him. So far the Comte could have been hidden to a marvel. No one knows of his presence on the train except Madame. He has been careful that the maid did not see his face. All that she could say is that he was tall and dark. It is all most conveniently vague. They are alone, and the train rushes through the night. There would be no outcry, no struggle, for the man is, so she thinks, her lover." He turned gently to Vanalden. "Death, monsieur, must have been almost instantaneous. We will pass over that quickly. The Comte takes the jewel case which lies ready to his hand. Shortly afterwards the train draws into Lyon." Monsieur Carrege nodded his approval. "Precisely. The conductor without descends. It would be easy for our man to leave the train unseen. It would be easy to catch a train back to Paris or anywhere he pleases. And the crime would be put down as an ordinary train robbery. But for the letter found in Madame's bag, the Comte would not have been mentioned." "It was an oversight on his part not to search that bag," declared the commissary. "Without doubt he thought she had destroyed that letter. It was, pardon me, monsieur, it was an indiscretion of the first water to keep it." "And yet," murmured Poirot, "it was an indiscretion the Comte might have foreseen." "You mean?" "I mean we are all agreed on one point, and that is that the Comte de la Roche knows one subject à fond: women. How was it that, knowing women as he does, he did not foresee that Madame would have kept that letter?" "Yes, yes," said the examining magistrate doubtfully, "there is something in what you say. But at such times, you understand, a man is not master of himself. He does not reason calmly. Mon Dieu," he added with feeling, "if our criminals kept their heads and acted with intelligence, how should we capture them?" Poirot smiled to himself. "It seems to me a clear case," said the other, "but a difficult one to prove. The Comte is a slippery customer, and unless the maid can identify him—" "Which is most unlikely," said Poirot. "True, true." The examining magistrate rubbed his chin. "It is going to be difficult." "If he did indeed commit the crime—" began Poirot. Monsieur Coe interrupted. "If you say if?" "Yes, monsieur le juge, I say if." The other looked at him sharply. "You are right," he said at last. "We go too fast. It is possible that the Comte may have an alibi. Then we should look foolish." "Ah, ça, par exemple," replied Poirot. "That is of no importance whatever. Naturally, if he committed the crime, he will have an alibi. A man with the Comte's experience does not neglect to take precautions. No, I said if for a very different reason." "And what was that?" Poirot wagged an emphatic forefinger. "The psychology." "Eh?" said the commissary. "The psychology is at fault. The Comte is a scoundrel, yes. The Comte is a swindler, yes. The Comte preys upon women, yes. He proposes to steal Madame's jewels, again, yes. Is he the kind of man to commit murder? I say no. A man of the type of the Comte is always a coward. He takes no risks. He plays the safe, the mean, what the English call the low-down game. But murder, 100 times no." He shook his head in a dissatisfied manner. The examining magistrate, however, did not seem disposed to agree with him. "The day always comes when such gentry lose their heads and go too far," he observed sagely. "Doubtless that is the case here. Without wishing to disagree with you, Monsieur Poirot." "It was only an opinion," Poirot hastened to explain. "The case is, of course, in your hands, and you will do what seems fit to you. I am satisfied in my own mind that the Comte de la Roche is the man we need to get hold of," said Monsieur Carrege. "You agree with me, Monsieur le Commissaire?" "Perfectly. And you, Monsieur Vanalden?" "Yes," said the millionaire. "Yes, the man is a thorough-paced villain, no doubt about it." "It will be difficult to lay hands on him, I'm afraid," said the magistrate, "but we will do our best. Telegraphed instructions shall go out at once." "Permit me to assist you," said Poirot. "There need be no difficulty." "Eh?" The others stared at him. The little man smiled beamingly back at them. "It is my business to know things," he explained. "The Comte is a man of intelligence. He is at present at a villa he has leased, the Villa Marina at Antibes." Chapter 16. Poirot discusses the case. Everybody looked respectfully at Poirot. Undoubtedly the little man had scored heavily. The commissary laughed on a rather hollow note. "You teach us all our business," he cried. "Monsieur Poirot knows more than the police." Poirot gazed complacently at the ceiling, adopting a mock-modest air. "What will you? It is my little hobby," he murmured, "to know things. Naturally I have the time to indulge it. I'm not overburdened with affairs." "Ah," said the commissary, shaking his head portentously. "As for me—" He made an exaggerated gesture to represent the cares that lay on his shoulders. Poirot turned suddenly to Vanalden. "You agree, monsieur, with this view? You feel certain that the Comte de la Roche is the murderer?" "Why, it would seem so, yes, certainly." Something guarded in the answer made the examining magistrate look at the American curiously. Vanalden seemed aware of his scrutiny, and made an effort as though to shake off some preoccupation. "What about my son-in-law?" he asked. "You have acquainted him with the news. He is in Nice, I understand." "Certainly, monsieur." The commissary hesitated and then murmured very discreetly, "You are doubtless aware, Monsieur Vanalden, that Monsieur Kettering was also one of the passengers on the blue train that night." The millionaire nodded. "Heard it just before I left London," he vouchsafed laconically. "He tells us," continued the commissary, "that he had no idea his wife was travelling on the train." "I bet he hadn't," said Vanalden grimly. "It would have been rather a nasty shock to him if he'd come across her on it." The three men looked at him questioningly. "I'm not going to mince matters," said Vanalden savagely. "No one knows what my poor girl has had to put up with. Derek Kettering wasn't alone. He had a lady with him." "Ah?" "Mireille, the dancer." Monsieur Carrege and the commissary looked at each other and nodded as though confirming some previous conversation. Monsieur Carrege leaned back in his chair, joined his hands, and fixed his eyes on the ceiling. "Ah," he murmured again. "One wondered." He coughed. "One has heard rumours." "The lady," said Monsieur Coe, "is very notorious." "And also," murmured Poirot softly, "very expensive." Vanalden had gone very red in the face. He leant forward and hit the table a bang with his fist. "See here," he cried, "my son-in-law is a damned scoundrel." He glared at them, looking from one face to another. "Oh, I know," he went on. "Good looks and a charming, easy manner. It took me in once upon a time. I suppose he pretended to be broken-hearted when you broke the news to him. That is, if he didn't know it already." "Oh, it came as a complete surprise to him. He was overwhelmed." "Darned young hypocrite," said Vanalden. "Simulated great grief, I suppose." "No," said the commissary cautiously. "I would not quite say that. Eh, Monsieur Carrege?" The magistrate brought the tips of his fingers together and half-closed his eyes. "Shock, bewilderment, horror, these things, yes," he declared judicially. "Great sorrow, no, I should not say that." Hercule Poirot spoke once more. "Permit me to ask, Monsieur Vanalden, does Monsieur Kettering benefit by the death of his wife?" "He benefits to the tune of a couple of millions," said Vanalden. "Dollars?" "Pounds. I settled that sum on Ruth absolutely on her marriage. She made no will and leaves no children, so the money will go to her husband, whom she was on the point of divorcing, murmured Poirot. Ah, yes, précisément. The commissary turned and looked sharply at him. Do you mean, he began. I mean nothing, said Poirot. I arrange the facts, that is all. Vanalden stared at him with awakening interest. The little man rose to his feet. I do not think I can be of any further service to you, Monsieur le Juge, he said politely, bowing to Monsieur Carrege. You will keep me informed of the course of events? It will be a kindness. But certainly, most certainly. Vanalden rose also. You don't want me any more at present? No, monsieur, we have all the information we need for the moment. Then I will walk a little way with Monsieur Poirot, that is, if he does not object. Enchanted, monsieur, said the little man with a bow. Vanalden lighted a large cigar, having first offered one to Poirot, who declined it and lit one of his own tiny cigarettes. A man of great strength of character, Vanalden already appeared to be his everyday, normal self once more. After strolling along for a minute or two in silence, the millionaire spoke. I take it, Monsieur Poirot, that you no longer exercise your profession? That is so, monsieur. I enjoy the world. Yet you are assisting the police in this affair. Monsieur, if a doctor walks along the street and an accident happens, does he say, I have retired from my profession, I will continue my walk, when there is someone bleeding to death at his feet? If I had been already in Nice and the police had sent to me and asked me to assist them, I should have refused. But this affair, the good God thrust it upon me. You were on the spot, said Vanalden thoughtfully. You examined the compartment, did you not? Poirot nodded. Doubtless you found things that were, shall we say, suggestive to you? Perhaps, said Poirot. I hope you see what I'm leading up to, said Vanalden. It seems to me that the case against this Comte de la Roche is perfectly clear, but I am not a fool. I have been watching you for this last hour or so, and I realize that for some reason of your own, you don't agree with that theory. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. I may be wrong. So we come to the favor I want to ask you. Will you act in this matter for me? For you personally? That was my meaning. Poirot was silent for a moment or two. Then he said, You realize what you're asking? I guess so, said Vanalden. Very well, said Poirot. I accept, but in that case I must have frank answers to my questions. Why, certainly, that is understood. Poirot's manner changed. He became suddenly brusque and businesslike. This question of a divorce, he said. It was you who advised your daughter to bring the suit. Yes. When? About 10 days ago, I had had a letter from her complaining of her husband's behavior, and I put it to her very strongly that divorce was the only remedy. In what way did she complain of his behavior? He was being seen about with a very notorious lady, the one we have been speaking of, Mireille. The dancer, aha, and Madame Katherine objected. Was she very devoted to her husband? I would not say that, said Vanalden, hesitating a little. It was not her heart that suffered, it was her pride. Is that what you would say? Yes, I suppose you might put it like that. I gather that the marriage had not been a happy one from the beginning. Derek Kettering is rotten to the core, said Vanalden. He is incapable of making any woman happy. He is, as you say in England, a bad lot. That is right, is it not? Vanalden nodded. Très bien. You advise Madame to seek a divorce. She agrees. You consult your solicitors. When does Monsieur Kettering get news of what is in the wind? I sent for him myself and explained the course of action I proposed to take. And what did he say? Murmured Poirot softly. Vanalden's face darkened at the remembrance. He was infernally impudent. Excuse the question, monsieur, but did he refer to the Comte de la Roche? Not by name, growled the other unwillingly, but he showed himself cognizant of the affair. What, if I may ask, was Monsieur Kettering's financial position at the time? How do you suppose I should know that? Asked Vanalden, after a very brief hesitation. It seemed likely to me that you would inform yourself on that point. Well, You are quite right, I did. I discovered that Kettering was on the rocks. And now he has inherited £2 million. La vie, it is a strange thing, is it not? Vanalden looked at him sharply. What do you mean? I moralize, said Poirot. I reflect, I speak the philosophy. But to return to where we were, surely Monsieur Kettering did not propose to allow himself to be divorced without making a fight for it. Vanalden did not answer for a minute or two. Then he said, I don't exactly know what his intentions were. Did you hold any further communications with him? Again a slight pause, then Vanalden said, No. Poirot stopped dead, took off his hat and held out his hand. I must wish you good day, monsieur. I can do nothing for you. What are you getting at? Demanded Vanalden angrily. If you do not tell me the truth, I can do nothing. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. You may rest assured, Monsieur Vanalden, that I know how to be discreet. Very well, then, said the millionaire. I'll admit that I was not speaking the truth just now. I did have further communication with my son-in-law. Yes? To be exact, I sent my secretary, Major Knighton, to see him, with instructions to offer him the sum of £100,000 in cash if the divorce went through undefended. A pretty sum of money, said Poirot appreciatively. And the answer of monsieur your son-in-law? He sent back word that I could go to hell, replied the millionaire succinctly. Ah, said Poirot. He betrayed no emotion of any kind. At the moment he was engaged in methodically recording facts. Monsieur Kettering has told the police that he neither saw nor spoke to his wife on the journey from England. Are you inclined to believe that statement, monsieur? Yes, I am, said Vanalden. He would take particular pains to keep out of her way, I should say. Why? Because he had got that woman with him. Morel? Yes. How did you come to know that fact? A man of mine, whom I had put on to watch him, reported to me that they had both left by that train. I see, said Poirot. In that case, as you said before, he would not be likely to attempt to hold any communication with Madame Kettering. The little man fell silent for some time. Vanalden did not interrupt his meditation. Chapter 17. An aristocratic gentleman. You have been to the Riviera before, Georges, said Poirot to his valet the following morning. George was an intensely English, rather wooden-faced individual. Yes, sir. I was here 2 years ago when I was in the service of Lord Edward Frampton. And today, murmured his master, you are here with Hercule Poirot, how one mounts in the world. The valet made no reply to this observation. After a suitable pause, he asked, The brown lounge suit, sir. The wind is somewhat chilly today. There is a grease spot on the waistcoat, objected Poirot. A morceau of filet de sole à la Jeannette alighted there when I was lunching at the Ritz last Tuesday. There is no spot there now, sir, said George reproachfully. I have removed it. Très bien, said Poirot. I am pleased with you, Georges. Thank you, sir. There was a pause, and then Poirot murmured dreamily, Supposing, my good Georges, that you had been born in the same social sphere as your late master, Lord Edward Frampton, that, penniless yourself, you had married an extremely wealthy wife, but that that wife proposed to divorce you with excellent reasons, what would you do about it? I should endeavour, sir, replied George, to make her change her mind. By peaceful or by forcible methods? George looked shocked. You will excuse me, sir, he said, but a gentleman of the aristocracy would not behave like a Whitechapel coster. He would not do anything low. Would he not, Georges? I wonder now. Well, perhaps you are right. There was a knock on the door. George went to it and opened it a discreet inch or two. A low, murmured colloquy went on, and then the valet returned to Poirot. A note, sir. Poirot took it. It was from Monsieur Coe, the commissary of police. We are about to interrogate the Comte de la Roche. The juge d'instruction begs that you will be present. Quickly, my suit, Georges. I must hasten myself. A quarter of an hour later, spick and span in his brown suit, Poirot entered the examining magistrate's room. Monsieur Coe was already there, and both he and Monsieur Carrege greeted Poirot with polite empressement. The affair is somewhat discouraging, murmured Monsieur Coe. It appears that the Comte arrived in Nice the day before the murder. If that is true, it will settle your affair nicely for you, responded Poirot. Monsieur Carrege cleared his throat. "We must not accept this alibi without very cautious inquiry," he declared. He struck the bell upon the table with his hand. In another minute a tall, dark man, exquisitely dressed, with a somewhat haughty cast of countenance, entered the room. So very aristocratic-looking was the Count that it would have seemed sheer heresy even to whisper that his father had been an obscure corn chandler in Nantes, which, as a matter of fact, was the case. Looking at him, one would have been prepared to swear that innumerable ancestors of his must have perished by the guillotine in the French Revolution. "I am here, gentlemen," said the Count haughtily. "May I ask why you wish to see me?" "Pray be seated, Monsieur le Comte," said the examining magistrate politely. "It is the affair of the death of Madame Kettering that we are investigating." "The death of Madame Kettering? I do not understand." "You were acquainted with the lady, I believe, Monsieur le Comte." "Certainly I was acquainted with her. What has that to do with the matter?" Sticking an eyeglass in his eye, he looked coldly round the room, his glance resting longest on Poirot, who was gazing at him with a kind of simple, innocent admiration which was most pleasing to the Count's vanity. Monsieur Carrege leaned back in his chair and cleared his throat. "You do not perhaps know, Monsieur le Comte," he paused, "that Madame Kettering was murdered?" "Murdered? Mon Dieu, how terrible!" The surprise and the sorrow were excellently done, so well done indeed as to seem wholly natural. "Madame Kettering was strangled between Paris and Lyons," continued Monsieur Carrege, "and her jewels were stolen." "It is iniquitous," cried the Count warmly. "The police should do something about these train bandits. Nowadays no one is safe." "In Madame's handbag," continued the judge, "we found a letter to her from you. She had, it seemed, arranged to meet you?" The Count shrugged his shoulders and spread out his hands. "Of what use are concealments?" he said frankly. "We are all men of the world. Privately, and between ourselves, I admit the affair." "You met her in Paris and travelled down with her, I believe," said Monsieur Carrege. "That was the original arrangement, but by Madame's wish it was changed. I was to meet her at Hyères." "You did not meet her on the train at the Gare de Lyon on the evening of the 14th. "On the contrary, I arrived in Nice on the morning of that day, so what you suggest is impossible." Quite so," said Monsieur Carrege. "As a matter of form, you would perhaps give me an account of your movements during the evening and night of the 14th. The Count reflected for a minute. "I dined in Monte Carlo at the Café de Paris. Afterwards I went to the Le Sporting. I won a few thousand francs." He shrugged his shoulders. "I returned home at perhaps 1 o'clock." "Pardon me, monsieur, but how did you return home?" "In my own two-seater car." "No one was with you?" "No one." "You could produce witnesses in support of this statement?" "Doubtless many of my friends saw me there that evening. I dined alone." "Your servant admitted you on your return to your villa?" "I let myself in with my own latchkey." "Ah," murmured the magistrate. Again he struck the bell on the table with his hand. The door opened, and a messenger appeared. "Bring in the maid, Mason," said Monsieur Carrege. "Very good, Monsieur le Juge." Ada Mason was brought in. "Will you be so good, mademoiselle, as to look at this gentleman? To the best of your ability, was it he who entered your mistress's compartment in Paris?" The woman looked long and searchingly at the Count, who was, Poirot fancied, rather uneasy under this scrutiny. "I could not say, sir, I am sure," said Mason at last. "It might be, and again it might not. Seeing as how I only saw his back, it's hard to say. I rather think it was the gentleman." "But you are not sure?" "No, oh," said Mason unwillingly. No, I am not sure." "You have seen this gentleman before in Curzon Street?" Mason shook her head. "I should not be likely to see any visitors that come to Curzon Street," she explained, "unless they were staying in the house." "Very well, that will do," said the examining magistrate sharply. Evidently he was disappointed. "One moment," said Poirot. "There is a question I would like to put to mademoiselle, if I may?" "Certainly, Monsieur Poirot, certainly, by all means." Poirot addressed himself to the maid. "What happened to the ticket?" "The tickets, sir?" "Yes, the tickets from London to Nice. Did you or your mistress have them?" "The mistress had her own Pullman ticket, sir. The others were in my charge." "What happened to them?" I gave them to the conductor on the French train, sir. He said it was usual. I hope I did right, sir. Oh, quite right, quite right. A mere matter of detail. Both Monsieur Coe and the examining magistrate looked at him curiously. Mason stood uncertainly for a minute or two, and then the magistrate gave her a brief nod of dismissal, and she went out. Poirot scribbled something on a scrap of paper and handed it across to Monsieur Carrege. The latter read it, and his brow cleared. "Well, gentlemen," demanded the Count haughtily, "am I to be detained further?" "Assuredly not, Monsieur Carrege hastened to say, with a great deal of amiability. "Everything is now cleared up as regards your own position in this affair. Naturally, in view of Madame's letter, we were bound to question you." The Count rose, picked up his handsome stick from the corner, and, with rather a curt bow, left the room. "And that is that," said Monsieur Carrege. "You were quite right, Monsieur Poirot. Much better to let him feel he is not suspected. 2 of my men will shadow him night and day, and at the same time we will go into the question of the alibi. It seems to me rather a fluid one." "Possibly," agreed Poirot thoughtfully. "I asked Monsieur Kettering to come here this morning," continued the magistrate, "though really I doubt if we have much to ask him, but there are 1 or 2 suspicious circumstances." He paused, rubbing his nose. "Such as?" asked Poirot. "Well," the magistrate coughed, "this lady with whom he is said to be travelling, Mademoiselle Mirel, she is staying at one hotel and he at another. That strikes me, as rather odd." "It looks," said Monsieur Coe, "as though they were being careful." "Exactly," said Monsieur Carrege triumphantly. "And what should they have to be careful about?" "An excess of caution is suspicious, eh?" said Poirot. "Précisément." "We might, I think," murmured Poirot, "ask Monsieur Kettering 1 or 2 questions." The magistrate gave instructions. A moment or 2 later, Derek Kettering, debonair as ever, entered the room. "Good morning, monsieur," said the judge politely. "Good morning," said Derek Kettering curtly. "You sent for me. Has anything fresh turned up?" "Pray sit down, monsieur." Derek took a seat and flung his hat and stick on the table. "Well?" he asked impatiently. "We have so far no fresh data," said Monsieur Carrege cautiously. "That's very interesting," said Derek dryly. "Did you send for me here in order to tell me that?" "We naturally thought, monsieur, that you would like to be informed of the progress of the case," said the magistrate severely, "even if the progress was non-existent. We also wish to ask you a few questions." "Ask away." "You are quite sure that you neither saw nor spoke with your wife on the train?" "I've answered that already. I did not." "You had, no doubt, your reasons." Derek stared at him suspiciously. "I did not know she was on the train," he explained, spacing his words elaborately, as though to someone dull of intellect. "That is what you say, yes," murmured Monsieur Carrege. A frown suffused Derek's face. "I should like to know what you're driving at. Do you know what I think, Monsieur Carrege?" "What do you think, monsieur?" "I think the French police are vastly overrated. Surely you must have some data as to these gangs of train robbers. It's outrageous that such a thing could happen on a train de luxe like that, and that the French police should be helpless to deal with the matter." "We are dealing with it, monsieur, never fear." "Madame Kettering, I understand, did not leave a will," interposed Poirot suddenly. His fingertips were joined together, and he was looking intently at the ceiling. "I don't think she ever made one," said Kettering. "Why?" "It is a very pretty little fortune that you inherit there," said Poirot. "A very pretty little fortune." Although his eyes were still on the ceiling, he managed to see the dark flush that rose to Derek Kettering's face. "What do you mean? And who are you?" Poirot gently uncrossed his knees, withdrew his gaze from the ceiling, and looked the young man full in the face. "My name is Hercule Poirot," he said quietly, "and I am probably the greatest detective in the world. You are quite sure that you did not see or speak to your wife on that train?" "What are you getting at? Do you mean to insinuate that I killed her?" He laughed suddenly. "I mustn't lose my temper. It's too palpably absurd. Why, if I killed her, I should have had no need to steal her jewels, would I?" "That is true," murmured Poirot, with a rather crestfallen air. "I did not think of that." If ever there were a clear case of murder and robbery, this is it, said Derek Kettering. Poor Ruth, it was those damned rubies did for her. It must have got about she had them with her. There has been murder done for those same stones before now, I believe. Poirot sat up suddenly in his chair. A very faint green light glowed in his eyes. He looked extraordinarily like a sleek, well-fed cat. One more question, Monsieur Kettering, he said. Will you give me the date when you last saw your wife? Let me see, Kettering reflected. It must have been, yes, over 3 weeks ago. I'm afraid I can't give you the date exactly. No matter, said Poirot dryly. That is all I wanted to know. Well, said Derek Kettering impatiently. Anything further? He looked towards Monsieur Carrege. The latter sought inspiration from Poirot and received it in a very faint shake of the head. No, Monsieur Kettering, he said politely. No, I do not think we need trouble you any further. I wish you good morning. Good morning, said Kettering. He went out, banging the door behind him. Poirot leaned forward and spoke sharply as soon as the young man was out of the room. Tell me, he said peremptorily, when did you speak of these rubies to Monsieur Kettering? I have not spoken of them, said Monsieur Carrege. It was only yesterday afternoon that we learnt about them from Monsieur Vanalden. Yes, but there was a mention of them in the Comte's letter. Monsieur Carrege looked pained. Naturally, I did not speak of that letter to Monsieur Kettering, he said in a shocked voice. It would have been most indiscreet at the present juncture of affairs. Poirot leaned forward and tapped the table. Then how did he know about them? He demanded softly. Madame could not have told him, for he has not seen her for 3 weeks. It seems unlikely that either Monsieur Vanalden or his secretary would have mentioned them. Their interviews with him have been on entirely different lines, and there has not been any hint or reference to them in the newspapers. He got up and took his hat and stick. And yet, he murmured to himself, our gentleman knows all about them. I wonder now, yes, I wonder. Chapter 18. Derek Lunches. Derek Kettering went straight to the Negresco, where he ordered a couple of cocktails and disposed of them rapidly. Then he stared moodily out over the dazzling blue sea. He noted the passers-by mechanically, a damned dull crowd, badly dressed and painfully uninteresting. One hardly ever saw anything worthwhile nowadays. Then he corrected this last impression rapidly as a woman placed herself at a table a little distance away from him. She was wearing a marvellous confection of orange and black, with a little hat that shaded her face. He ordered a third cocktail. Again he stared out to sea, and then suddenly he started. A well-known perfume assailed his nostrils, and he looked up to see the orange and black lady standing beside him. He saw her face now, and recognized her. It was Mirelle. She was smiling that insolent, seductive smile he knew so well. "Derek," she murmured, "you are pleased to see me, no?" She dropped into a seat the other side of the table. "But welcome me then, stupid one," she mocked. "This is an unexpected pleasure," said Derek. "When did you leave London?" She shrugged her shoulders. "A day or two ago." "And the Parthenon?" "I have, how do you say it, given them the chuck." "Really? You are not very amiable, Derek." "Do you expect me to be?" Mirelle lit a cigarette and puffed at it for a few minutes before saying, "You think perhaps that it is not prudent so soon?" Derek stared at her. Then he shrugged his shoulders and remarked formally, "You are lunching here?" "Mais oui, I'm lunching with you." "I am extremely sorry," said Derek. "I have a very important engagement." "Mon Dieu, but you men are like children," exclaimed the dancer. "But yes, it is the spoilt child that you act to me ever since that day in London, when you flung yourself out of my flat, you sulk. Ah, mais c'est inouï." "My dear girl," said Derek, "I really don't know what you are talking about. We agreed in London that rats desert a sinking ship. That is all that there is to be said." In spite of his careless words, his face looked haggard and strained. Mirelle leaned forward suddenly. "You cannot deceive me," she murmured. I know what you have done for me." He looked up at her sharply. Some undercurrent in her voice arrested his attention. She nodded her head at him. "Ah, have no fear, I am discreet. You are magnificent. You have a superb courage, but all the same, it was I who gave you the idea that day when I said to you in London that accidents sometimes happened. And you are not in danger? The police do not suspect you? What the devil—" "Hush!" She held up a slim olive hand with one big emerald on the little finger. "You are right. I should not have spoken so in a public place. We will not speak of the matter again, but our troubles are ended. Our life together will be wonderful. Wonderful." Derek laughed suddenly, a harsh, disagreeable laugh. "So the rats come back, do they? 2 million makes a difference, of course it does. I ought to have known that." He laughed again. "You will help me to spend that 2 million, won't you, Morel? You know how. No woman better." He laughed again. "Hush!" cried the dancer. "What is the matter with you, Derek? See, people are turning to stare at you." "Me? I will tell you what is the matter. I have finished with you, Morel. Do you hear? Finished." Morel did not take it as he expected her to do. She looked at him for a minute or two, and then she smiled softly. "But what a child! You are angry, you are sore, and all because I am practical. Did I not always tell you that I adored you?" She leaned forward. "But I know you, Derek. Look at me. See, it is Morel who speaks to you. You cannot live without her, you know it. I loved you before. I will love you 100 times more now. I will make life wonderful for you, but wonderful. There is no one like Morel." Her eyes burned into his. She saw him grow pale and draw in his breath, and she smiled to herself contentedly. She knew her own magic and power over men. "That is settled," she said softly, and gave a little laugh. "And now, Derek, will you give me lunch?" "No." He drew in his breath sharply and rose to his feet. "I am sorry, but I told you I have got an engagement." "You are lunching with someone else? Bah, I don't believe it." "I am lunching with that lady over there." He crossed abruptly to where a lady in white had just come up the steps. He addressed her a little breathlessly. "Miss Grey, will you have lunch with me? You met me at Lady Tamplin's, if you remember." Katherine looked at him for a minute or two with those thoughtful grey eyes that said so much. "Thank you," she said after a moment's pause. "I should like to very much." Chapter 19. An unexpected visitor. The Comte de la Roche had just finished déjeuner, consisting of an omelette fine's herbe, an entrecôte béarnaise, and a savarin au rhum. Wiping his fine black moustache delicately with his table napkin, the Comte rose from the table. He passed through the salon of the villa, noting with appreciation the few objets d'art which were carelessly scattered about. The Louis XV snuff-box, the satin shoe worn by Marie Antoinette, and the other historic trifles were part of the Comte's mise en scène. They were, he would explain to his fair visitors, heirlooms in his family. Passing through onto the terrace, the Comte looked out on the Mediterranean with an unseeing eye. He was in no mood for appreciating the beauties of scenery. A fully matured scheme had been rudely brought to naught, and his plans had to be cast afresh. Stretching himself out in a basket chair, a cigarette held between his white fingers, the Comte pondered deeply. Presently Hippolyte, his manservant, brought out coffee and a choice of liqueurs. The Comte selected some very fine old brandy. As the manservant was preparing to depart, the Comte arrested him with a slight gesture. Hippolyte stood respectfully to attention. His countenance was hardly a prepossessing one, but the correctitude of his demeanour went far to obliterate the fact. He was now the picture of respectful attention. "It is possible," said the Comte, "that in the course of the next few days various strangers may come to the house. They will endeavour to scrape acquaintance with you and with Marie. They will probably ask you various questions concerning me." "Yes, Monsieur le Comte." "Perhaps this has already happened." "No, Monsieur le Comte." "There have been no strangers about the place, you are certain?" "There has been no one, Monsieur le Comte." "That is well," said the Comte drily. "Nevertheless they will come, I am sure of it. They will ask questions." Hippolyte looked at his master in intelligent anticipation. The Comte spoke slowly, without looking at Hippolyte. "As you know, I arrived here last Tuesday morning. If the police or any other inquirer should question you, do not forget that fact. I arrived on Tuesday the 14th, not Wednesday the 15th. You understand?" "Perfectly, Monsieur le Comte. In an affair where a lady is concerned, it is always necessary to be discreet. I feel certain, Hippolyte, that you can be discreet." "I can be discreet, monsieur. And Marie?" "Marie also, I will answer for her." "That is well, then," murmured the Comte. When Hippolyte had withdrawn, The Comte sipped his black coffee with a reflective air. Occasionally he frowned, once he shook his head slightly, twice he nodded it. Into the midst of these cogitations came Hippolyte once more. "A lady, monsieur." "A lady?" The Comte was surprised. Not that a visit from a lady was an unusual thing at the Villa Marina. But at this particular moment the Comte could not think who the lady was likely to be. "She is, I think, a lady not known to monsieur," murmured the valet helpfully. The Comte was more and more intrigued. "Show her out here, Hippolyte," he commanded. A moment later, a marvellous vision in orange and black stepped out on the terrace, accompanied by a strong perfume of exotic blossoms. "Monsieur le Comte de la Roche?" "At your service, mademoiselle," said the Comte, bowing. "My name is Mirel. You may have heard of me." "Ah, indeed, mademoiselle, but who has not been enchanted by the dancing of Mademoiselle Mirel? Exquisite." The dancer acknowledged this compliment with a brief mechanical smile. "My descent upon you is unceremonious," she began. "But seat yourself, I beg of you, mademoiselle," cried the Comte, bringing forward a chair. Behind the gallantry of his manner he was observing her narrowly. There were very few things that the Comte did not know about women. True, his experience had not lain much in ladies of Mirel's class, who were themselves predatory. He and the dancer were, in a sense, birds of a feather. His arts, the Comte knew, would be thrown away on Mirel. She was a Parisienne, and a shrewd one. Nevertheless, there was one thing that the Comte could recognize infallibly when he saw it. He knew at once that he was in the presence of a very angry woman, and an angry woman, as the Comte was well aware, always says more than is prudent, and is occasionally a source of profit to a level-headed gentleman who keeps cool. "It is most amiable of you, mademoiselle, to honour my poor abode thus." "We have mutual friends in Paris," said Mirel. "I have heard of you from them, but I come to see you today for another reason. I have heard of you since I came to Nice. In a different way, you understand." "Ah?" said the Comte softly. "I will be brutal," continued the dancer. "Nevertheless, believe that I have your welfare at heart. They are saying in Nice, Monsieur le Comte, that you are the murderer of the English lady, Madame Kettering." "I the murderer of Madame Kettering? Bah, but how absurd!" He spoke more languidly than indignantly, knowing that he would thus provoke her further. "But yes," she insisted, "it is as I tell you." "It amuses people to talk," murmured the Comte indifferently. "It would be beneath me to take such wild accusations seriously." "You do not understand." Mirel bent forward, her dark eyes flashing. "It is not the idle talk of those in the streets. It is the police." "The police, ah?" The Comte sat up, alert once more. Mirel nodded her head vigorously several times. Yes, you comprehend me. I have friends everywhere, the prefect himself." She left the sentence unfinished, with an eloquent shrug of the shoulders. "Who is not indiscreet where a beautiful woman is concerned," murmured the Count politely. "The police believe that you killed Madame Kettering, but they are wrong." "Certainly they are wrong," agreed the Comte easily. "You say that, but you do not know the truth. I do." The Comte looked at her curiously. "You know who killed Madame Kettering? Is that what you would say, mademoiselle?" Mirel nodded vehemently. "Yes." "Who was it?" asked the Comte sharply. "Her husband." She bent nearer to the Comte, speaking in a low voice that vibrated with anger and excitement. "It was her husband who killed her." The Comte leant back in his chair. His face was a mask. "Let me ask you, mademoiselle, how do you know this?" "How do I know it?" Mirel sprang to her feet with a laugh. "He boasted of it beforehand. He was ruined, bankrupt, dishonoured. Only the death of his wife could save him. He told me so. He travelled on the same train, but she was not to know it. Why was that, I ask you? So that he might creep upon her in the night. Ah!" She shut her eyes. "I can see it happening." And the Count coughed. Perhaps, he murmured. "But surely, mademoiselle, in that case he would not steal the jewels." "The jewels!" breathed Mirel. "The jewels! Ah, those rubies!" Her eyes grew misty, a faraway light in them. The Comte looked at her curiously, wondering for the 100th time at the magical influence of precious stones on the female sex. He recalled her to practical matters. "What do you want me to do, mademoiselle?" Morel became alert and businesslike once more. "Surely it is simple. You will go to the police. You will say to them that Monsieur Kettering committed this crime. And if they do not believe me? If they ask for proof?" He was eyeing her closely. Morel laughed softly and drew her orange and black wrap closer round her. "Send them to me, Monsieur le Comte," she said softly. "I will give them the proof they want." Upon that she was gone, an impetuous whirlwind, her errand accomplished. The Comte looked after her, his eyebrows delicately raised. "She is in a fury," he murmured. "What has happened now to upset her? But she shows her hand too plainly. Does she really believe that Mr. Kettering killed his wife? She would like me to believe it. She would even like the police to believe it." He smiled to himself. He had no intention whatsoever of going to the police. He saw various other possibilities, to judge by his smile, an agreeable vista of them. Presently, however, his brow clouded. According to Morel, he was suspected by the police. That might be true, or it might not. An angry woman of the type of the dancer was not likely to bother about the strict veracity of her statements. On the other hand, she might easily have obtained inside information. In that case, his mouth set grimly. In that case, he must take certain precautions. He went into the house and questioned Hippolyte closely once more as to whether any strangers had been to the house. The valet was positive in his assurances that this was not the case. The Comte went up to his bedroom and crossed over to an old bureau that stood against the wall. He let down the lid of this, and his delicate fingers sought for a spring at the back of one of the pigeonholes. A secret drawer flew out. In it was a small brown paper package. The Comte took this out and weighed it in his hand carefully for a minute or two. Raising his hand to his head, with a slight grimace, he pulled out a single hair. This he placed on the lip of the drawer and shut it carefully. Still carrying the small parcel in his hand, he went downstairs and out of the house to the garage, where stood a scarlet two-seater car. 10 minutes later, he had taken the road for Monte Carlo. He spent a few hours at the casino, then sauntered out into the town. Presently, he re-entered the car and drove off in the direction of Mentone. Earlier in the afternoon, he had noticed an inconspicuous grey car some little distance behind him. He noticed it again now. He smiled to himself. The road was climbing steadily upwards. The Comte's foot pressed hard on the accelerator. The little red car had been specially built to the Comte's design and had a far more powerful engine than would have been suspected from its appearance. It shot ahead. Presently he looked back and smiled. The grey car was following behind. Smothered in dust, the little red car leaped along the road. It was travelling now at a dangerous pace, but the Comte was a first-class driver. Now they were going downhill, twisting and curving unceasingly. Presently the car slackened speed and finally came to a standstill before a bureau de poste. The Comte jumped out, lifted the lid of the tool chest, extracted the small brown paper parcel and hurried into the post office. 2 minutes later he was driving once more in the direction of Mentone. When the grey car arrived there, the Comte was drinking English 5 o'clock tea on the terrace of one of the hotels. Later, he drove back to Monte Carlo, dined there, and reached home once more at 11 o'clock. Hippolyte came out to meet him with a disturbed face. "Ah, Monsieur le Comte has arrived. Monsieur le Comte did not telephone me by any chance." The Comte shook his head. "And yet at 3 o'clock I received a summons from Monsieur le Comte to present myself to him at Nice, at the Negresco." "Really?" said the Comte. "And you went?" "Certainly, monsieur, but at the Negresco they knew nothing of Monsieur le Comte. He had not been there." "Ah," said the Comte, "doubtless at that hour Marie was out doing her afternoon marketing." "That is so, Monsieur le Comte." "Ah, well," said the Comte, "it is of no importance, a mistake." He went upstairs, smiling to himself. Once within his own room, he bolted his door and looked sharply round. Everything seemed as usual. He opened various drawers and cupboards. Then he nodded to himself. Things had been replaced almost exactly as he had left them, but not quite. It was evident that a very thorough search had been made. He went over to the bureau and pressed the hidden spring. The drawer flew open, but the hair was no longer where he had placed it. He nodded his head several times. They are excellent, our French police, he murmured to himself. Excellent, nothing escapes them. Chapter 20. Katherine makes a friend. On the following morning, Katherine and Lennox were sitting on the terrace of the Villa Margarite. Something in the nature of a friendship was springing up between them, despite the difference in age. But for Lennox, Katherine would have found life at the Villa Margarite quite intolerable. The Kettering case was the topic of the moment. Lady Tamplin frankly exploited her guest's connection with the affair for all it was worth. The most persistent rebuffs that Katherine could administer quite failed to pierce Lady Tamplin's self-esteem. Lennox adopted a detached attitude, seemingly amused at her mother's manoeuvres, and yet with a sympathetic understanding of Katherine's feelings. The situation was not helped by Chubby, whose naive delight was unquenchable, and who introduced Katherine to all and sundry as, "This is Miss Grey. You know that blue train business? She was in it up to the ears. Had a long talk with Ruth Kettering a few hours before the murder. Bit of luck for her, eh?" A few remarks of this kind had provoked Katherine that morning to an unusually tart rejoinder, and when they were alone together, Lennox observed in her slow drawl, "Not used to exploitation, are you? You have a lot to learn, Katherine." "I'm sorry I lost my temper. I don't as a rule." "It is about time you learnt to blow off steam. Chubby is only an ass. There is no harm in him. Mother, of course, is trying, but you can lose your temper with her until kingdom come, and it won't make any impression. She will open large, sad blue eyes at you and not care a bit." Katherine made no reply to this filial observation, and Lennox presently went on, "I am rather like Chubby. I delight in a good murder, and besides, well, knowing Derek makes a difference." Katherine nodded. "So you lunched with him yesterday," pursued Lennox reflectively. "Do you like him, Katherine?" Katherine considered for a minute or two. "I don't know," she said very slowly. "He is very attractive." "Yes, he is attractive." "What don't you like about him?" Katherine did not reply to the question, or at any rate not directly. "He spoke of his wife's death," she said. "He said he would not pretend that it had been anything but a bit of most marvellous luck for him." "And that shocked you, I suppose," said Lennox. She paused and then added in rather a queer tone of voice, "He likes you, Katherine." "He gave me a very good lunch," said Katherine, smiling. Lennox refused to be sidetracked. "I saw it the night he came here," she said thoughtfully, "the way he looked at you, and you are not his usual type, just the opposite. Well, I suppose it is like religion. You get it at a certain age." "Mademoiselle is wanted at the telephone," said Marie, appearing at the window of the salon. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot desires to speak with her." "More blood and thunder. Go on, Katherine. Go and dally with your detective." Monsieur Hercule Poirot's voice came neat and precise in its intonation to Katherine's ear. "That is Mademoiselle Grey who speaks? Bon, Mademoiselle, I have a word for you from Monsieur Vanalden, the father of Madame Kettering. He wishes very much to speak with you, either at the Villa Margarite or at his hotel, whichever you prefer." Katherine reflected for a moment, but she decided that for Vanalden to come to the villa, Marguerite would be both painful and unnecessary. Lady Tamplin would have hailed his advent with far too much delight. She never lost a chance of cultivating millionaires. She told Poirot that she would much rather come to Nice. "Excellent, mademoiselle. I will call for you myself in an auto. Shall we say in about 3/4 of an hour?" Punctually to the moment Poirot appeared, Katherine was waiting for him, and they drove off at once. "Well, mademoiselle, how goes it?" She looked at his twinkling eyes, and was confirmed in her first impression that there was something very attractive about Monsieur Hercule Poirot. "This is our own Roman policier, is it not?" said Poirot. "I made you the promise that we should study it together, and me, I always keep my promises." "You are too kind," murmured Katherine. You mock yourself at me, but do you want to hear the developments of the case, or do you not?" Katherine admitted that she did, and Poirot proceeded to sketch for her a thumbnail portrait of the Comte de la Roche. "You think he killed her?" said Katherine thoughtfully. "That is the theory," said Poirot guardedly. "Do you yourself believe that?" "I did not say so. And you, mademoiselle, what do you think?" Katherine shook her head. How should I know? I don't know anything about those things, but I should say that— Yes, said Poirot encouragingly. Well, from what you say, the Count does not sound the kind of man who would actually kill anybody. Ah, very good, cried Poirot. You agree with me. That is just what I have said. He looked at her sharply. But tell me, you have met Mr. Derek Kettering? I met him at Lady Tamplin's, and I lunched with him yesterday. A mauvais sujet, said Poirot, shaking his head. But les femmes, they like that, eh? He twinkled at Katherine, and she laughed. He is the kind of man one would notice anywhere, continued Poirot. Doubtless you observed him on the blue train? Yes, I noticed him. In the restaurant car? No, I didn't notice him at meals at all. I only saw him once, going into his wife's compartment. Poirot nodded. A strange business, he murmured. I believe you said you were awake, mademoiselle, and looked out of your window at Lyons. You saw no tall, dark man such as the Comte de la Roche leave the train? Katherine shook her head. I don't think I saw anyone at all, she said. There was a youngish lad in a cap and overcoat who got out, but I don't think he was leaving the train, only walking up and down the platform. There was a fat Frenchman with a beard in pyjamas and an overcoat who wanted a cup of coffee. Otherwise, I think there were only the train attendants. Poirot nodded his head several times. It is like this, you see, he confided. The Comte de la Roche has an alibi. An alibi, it is a very pestilential thing, and always open to the gravest suspicion. But here we are, and they went straight up to Vanalden's suite where they found Knighton. Poirot introduced him to Katherine. After a few commonplaces had been exchanged, Knighton said, I will tell Mr. Vanalden that Miss Grey is here. He went through a second door into an adjoining room. There was a low murmur of voices, and then Vanalden came into the room and advanced towards Katherine with outstretched hand, giving her at the same time a shrewd and penetrating glance. I am pleased to meet you, Miss Grey, he said simply. I have been wanting very badly to hear what you can tell me about Ruth. The quiet simplicity of the millionaire's manner appealed to Katherine strongly. She felt herself in the presence of a very genuine grief, the more real for its absence of outward sign. He drew forward a chair. Sit here, will you, and just tell me all about it. Poirot and Knighton retired discreetly into the other room, and Katherine and Vanalden were left alone together. She found no difficulty in her task. Quite simply and naturally, she related her conversation with Ruth Kettering, word for word as nearly as she could. He listened in silence, leaning back in his chair, with one hand shading his eyes. When she had finished, he said quietly, Thank you, my dear. They both sat silent for a minute or two. Katherine felt that words of sympathy would be out of place. When the millionaire spoke, it was in a different tone. I am very grateful to you, Miss Grey. I think you did something to ease my poor Ruth's mind in the last hours of her life. Now I want to ask you something. You know, Monsieur Poirot will have told you, about the scoundrel that my poor girl had got herself mixed up with. He was the man of whom she spoke to you, the man she was going to meet. In your judgment, do you think she might have changed her mind after her conversation with you? Do you think she meant to go back on her word? I can't honestly tell you. She had certainly come to some decision and seemed more cheerful in consequence of it. She gave you no idea where she intended to meet the skunk, whether in Paris or at Hyères. Katherine shook her head. She said nothing as to that. Ah, said Vanalden thoughtfully, and that is the important point. Well, time will show. He got up and opened the door of the adjoining room. Poirot and Knighton came back. Katherine declined the millionaire's invitation to lunch, and Knighton went down with her and saw her into the waiting car. He returned to find Poirot and Vanalden deep in conversation. If we only knew, said the millionaire thoughtfully, what decision Ruth came to. It might have been any of half a dozen. She might have meant to leave the train at Paris and cable to me. She may have meant to have gone on to the south of France and have an explanation with the Count there. We are in the dark, absolutely in the dark. But we have the maid's word for it that she was both startled and dismayed at the Count's appearance at the station in Paris. That was clearly not part of the preconceived plan. You agree with me, Knighton? The secretary started. I beg your pardon, Mr. Vanalden, I was not listening. Daydreaming, eh? Said Vanalden. That's not like you. I believe that girl has bowled you over. Knighton blushed. She is a remarkably nice girl, said Vanalden thoughtfully. Very nice. Did you happen to notice her eyes? Any man, said Knighton, would be bound to notice her eyes.